Okay, I think I'm going to begin this workshop feedback session. And then there's just one more thing until you're all set free, and that's Mark's summary of the conference, which is not to be missed. Either is this. This is not to be missed, obviously, as well. So we have a 5-minute feedback session from each of the 5 workshops that took place throughout the conference. We will have time for a few questions at the end. Please save your questions until the end, and I'll be checking Twitter as well to see if anything comes up. And we may finish slightly ahead of schedule, but we will finish on time, whatever happens. And we're going to take this in alphabetical order, and then the speakers will present their feedback from the 3 sessions. Now, it's a challenge to fit however many hours worth of conversation into 5 minutes. So I would say that these workshops, this feedback session wasn't the point of the workshops. That wasn't what they were all for. The workshops were about collaboration and people talking and working with those they hadn't worked with before and working together on some of these big themes. So this is a small part of the whole, and obviously we hope conversations will go on beyond today. So without further ado, I will introduce Anne, no, Emma, who is going to present on behalf of the first workshop, and she was not the chair, she was one of the members of the workshop, and this was on reach and reputation, about how authors and editors manage visibility and readability. So over to Emma. Thank you. You may, it's up to you, yeah, that's fine. He's going to be doing it.
Oh, perfect, okay.
No, you've
got a button? Amazing. Hello. So the way that we tackled this was that we split into 4 subgroups, which we felt after much discussion were the main problems facing trying to get people to engage with readership and dissemination, that kind of stuff. One of which is overcoming author apathy, self-explanatory, recognizing the outputs beyond publication, so making sure that people see exactly what those outputs are beyond just getting published in a specific journal with a specific impact factor. Who is going to pay, which was probably the most challenging one, and the fact there's also just too many tools. So firstly, overcoming author apathy. So we then looked at the ways that the different stakeholders that are involved in the process can possibly contribute to kind of overcome these different barriers. So first off, publishers. I won't read it all out, but you'll see that there's things like publishers kind of engaging more with metrics, potentially asking for ORCIDs when people are submitting papers to allow the collation of those metrics to be done more in a better way. And also, one that pinged with me as a publisher is allowing people to publicise at the point of acceptance. So taking that when that person is the most excited about their paper and then encouraging them to publicise, as opposed to them then waiting until it's actually published. Institutions as well, this was an interesting one. Specifically, the one that I like is getting them induction, so new employees, as part of their induction, it's talking about how they have a job to do in terms of promoting their research to the greater world out there. And also rewarding people who are active in this sphere in their appraisals. So as opposed to saying, well, you spent too much time on Twitter, saying to people, actually, that was great, here's the feedback we've had about your blogs, and this is how it's impacting us. And also just for the people who are already the rock stars, to maybe encourage their peers to do more. Recognising outputs beyond publication. So this was, again, about kind of just making it much more visible to people, the benefits of all this stuff beyond the point of publication. Again, there's stuff to do in terms of promoting the benefits of using things like repositories. There's also, I think, possibly the opportunity for people to work more closely in the institutions with like marketing departments and stuff, whose bread and butter are these analytics, but actually probably aren't communicating them internally too well. Somebody also asked that it would be great if there was an impact metric calculator, something that would sort of judge the value of different layers of impact. And that's crucially, for that to work, it should include online and offline readership. I think a lot of this conference is focused very much on the online, people using networks, etc. But actually, some of the crucial dissemination happens offline, people's having conversation with peers at conferences, that kind of thing as well. And that should also be captured. Who is going to pay? So this one we felt that the researchers probably are not the ones who are going to put their hands in their pockets and pay for any of this kind of stuff. So they kind of quite quickly got taken out of the equation. Publishers, I think the idea was that they should engage more with these services as a service to their community and to their authors, although there is the caveat that obviously publishers will only be able to provide information based on their own publications. So if you want a whole of market approach, that's not going to necessarily come from the publishers. Institutions, again, they've got this pressure to demonstrate impact, and potentially there should be some kind of impact officer role, which I know does appear in some universities, or somebody within a marketing department whose role is not just kind of pushing out to the wider world what's happening, but doing that internal communications exercise of monitoring the impact of things that people are doing and how that then affects that. And a crucial part of that is looking at the end-to-end stuff. So communicating internally exactly how that impact, how that work that they do, that blogging, that peer-to-peer work they do, actually impact on the bottom line of the university in terms of funding. And then finally, too many tools. So I think there was a definite feeling that we're at the point in all of this change where there's a huge amount of development going on from all over the place, from startups, from small institutions, from absolutely everywhere. And we're now at the point where we need something to overlay onto that to kind of give people some kind of contextual understanding of what's working, what's not working. And somebody came up with a really nice idea, which is a kind of trip advisor for these kind of tools. So something that allows people to feed back on what's working. And that includes tools not just that are being developed specifically with scholarly communications in mind, but also things like the free tools that come about as a part of all the other social networks, for example, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, they all have their own analytics programs as well that people could use, and just a way of researchers being able to communicate to each other what's effective would be very helpful. Also, there was very much a feeling that there was a need for some kind of forum now to discuss this and bring it all together into one package with researchers and funders and institutions, etc. So that was us. Thanks.
Brilliant timing. That was Emma Griffiths. Thank you very much. Next, we have Peter Lawson on behalf of Workshop B, which was Trust in Subscription Agents. How can we ensure that subscription agents are trusted intermediaries? And there are no slides for this one, I believe. Okay, thank you.
So my shameful secret is out. My name is Peter Lawson, and I am the has-been chairman of the Association of Subscription Agents. I prefer emeritus, but somebody thought has-been was better. So this workshop was called Trust in Subscription Agents, and obviously would not be there at all if it were not for what happened to Sweats. So this all is re-establishing trust and transparency in a post-Sweats environment. Trust, I think, is probably a wrong word. Transparency is fair enough. It is much more about the due diligence which should be, and in many cases has not been, conducted by libraries who are the primary customer when finding and appointing an agent to act on their behalf. There seems to be very little doubt amongst libraries on the general desirability and indispensability of an agent for all of the obvious reasons, the one-stop shopping principle, all of the services which are included there, and the huge benefit of having a single transactional point or node. Because if you don't have this, the FTE implications, both for the publisher and for the libraries, are huge. A lot of people are involved in managing incoming stuff, or for the publisher in managing 1,000 different contacts, and for acquiring these 28,100 English language STM journals. This is a huge amount of incremental work. The libraries are generally not unhappy to pay for additional services. The age-old question is, whose agent is it? The agent takes his revenue from, on the one hand, discount from the publisher, on the other hand, possibly a service charge which he can make to the libraries if they are prepared to pay for it. That discount has been trimmed very substantially from the mid-20%, 20 or 30 years ago, right down to somewhere between 0 and 5% nowadays. And those 2.5% odd are not enough for agents to live on. So it does So agents are always looking for value-added services to offer. You then have the question of trust. If you start as an agent offering services on behalf of the publisher, you become perceived as a kind of sales representative, and the library then says, hey, I'm actually looking for a neutral agent. I need an agent who is obviously not operating on behalf of publishers. So whose agent am I is really a very fundamental question here. Because the library is saying to the agent, get me more stuff for cheaper, and the publisher is saying to the agent, sell more of my stuff. There is an element of mistrust, certainly. Publishers do not see many of the values which agents offer. Agents are very important for smaller publishers. There is the long tail of publishing, but these smaller publishers are very high maintenance. They have usually very few titles, which means there's many invoices, there's usually very low discounts. But ultimately, it does all come down to the money. And where is the money? And this is what has happened twice in the last 15 years with two very, very major agents, which is why these questions are still being asked. There is no obvious answer to this. There's been lots of conversation around escrow accounts, banks, all sorts of things. The publishers are increasingly developing and maintaining direct contact with libraries, which is very, very important in terms of collecting data and personal contacts, negotiations, but these negotiations may perfectly legitimately result in a deal, but 9 times out of 10, the library is going to want to make or have that deal actually transacted through an agent, which in many parts of the world will be a legal necessity anyway, either for reasons of local currency or for reasons of a legal requirement that it be a local company with local employees and so on. The principal problem is that librarians do not generally include in their skill set the ability to conduct due diligence on supplier companies. A librarian is a librarian. A supplier company is a commercial company. So within the university environment, that task should be part of a procurement process conducted by procurement officers or financial officers. So the financial decision-making responsibility needs to be clarified. And then finally, on the question of money, within universities, the question will increasingly now be raised about what on earth they are doing, paying 12 or 24 months in advance for a product which they simply don't do for anything else that they get. So at some point, the question of phased or staggered or installment payments is going to be raised more seriously, I think, which means that there is less money being exposed at any one time. Whether publishers and agents are going to be able to stand still for this, time will tell. I certainly have no idea. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. We now have Laura Cox, who is the chair of the workshop, along with Lorraine Estelle, on Counter 2017. The next release of Counter is upcoming, and this was looking at what the priorities should be. Thank you.
Hello. Apart from needing a box to stand on, I shall tell you a little about what we got up to. Over the next couple of years, Counter is moving towards creating the Code of Practice number 5. And so we were looking at some of the issues to do with Counter and what sort of processes need to be put in place to get to that end result of the final Code of Practice. As part of this, we looked at all business models, including open access. So where I'm not mentioning open access specifically, we did consider it. One of the first things that we looked at was identifying some of the existing problems. One is that there's a lack of compliance, and some areas where the compliance is what we described as woolly, where there's been an interpretation of the codes of practice, and the interpretations differ. Lots of questions from different publishers about the way that they had perceived the code of practice to work. So there's a level of ambiguity that's developed about the existing reports. They're very complicated, and there are a lot of definitions and glossaries. And so there was a level of interpretation or misinterpretation. And some of this happened due to the differing ways that people operate within publishers, that those who are looking at this very much from a technical point of view, and those who are looking at it from a business point of view, and where the language differs. I also felt there were some international issues. There were certainly a few cases where publishers in certain parts of the world where English language wasn't the first language hadn't actually heard of Counter. And there's a need for some education. We then looked at another area which we ended up calling inclusiveness. And this was really much more about what should we be counting, where is the use coming from, and what version of any particular content are we looking at. So we decided to go through the different pieces. Now, obviously, there's the use from the publisher platform, from aggregator platforms, but also increasingly interest in use coming from repositories, shared use platforms such as ResearchGate and Academia EDU, personal sharing, CRIS systems use, so they're increasingly adding content as well as other kinds of information. And then we needed to look at what versions we were going to be looking at the usage of, and what do you need to record. And there are issues surrounding version control. The version of record is relatively easy. It has a DOI attached. But accepted manuscripts don't always have DOIs, so it's difficult to track them. And then which reports need to be displayed? I mean, there's a granularity issue. Are we talking about article level, journal level, book level, chapter level, tables, figures, content objects? What is it that we're counting the usage of? We also looked at stakeholders. The stakeholders piece actually came up frequently. Counter had really, of old, was described as being a way for librarians to assess usage based on what was happening with publishers. But there are new requirements emerging. So the publishers want to know more about how the usage is spread. Where is it coming from? Is it on their platform? Is it shared usage? Is it somewhere else? And that informs business development. But there are also requirements from funders, institutions, and potentially from the researchers themselves, which would be an alternate measure of impact. So how much is the research that they fund being used? How much is my paper being used? And so we need a consolidation of complete usage to create that picture. The other issue that we identified was on trust. There were a number of issues where we felt that the trust in Counter reports had diminished, not to say that it weren't trusted at all, but it had diminished, because they're reporting a drop in usage. And that drop in usage is because they're reporting usage based on the publisher platforms or the aggregator platforms. The usage is actually, there's migration of usage, so it's actually coming in from other areas, non-publisher platforms, through sharing mechanisms and repositories. There are obviously the compliance issues where these things aren't quite the same, even though they're supposed to be standard reports, which is creating an issue with trust. And also robots, usage generated by mining, whether legitimate or otherwise. And a feeling that because the reports and the trends pictures keep changing, there was an assertion that means that something must have been wrong or something must be wrong now. So these were the pieces that we needed to address. And so we worked through them in terms of solutions. And these aren't solutions. This is a long process for Counter. And so we were just looking for the path of travel, where were we going to head next? So in terms of ambiguity, we talked a lot about consultation. creating focus groups which included technical, business and strategic people who would be able to talk to each other from different points of view within those organisations that are actually producing counter reports, and ensuring an understanding of the definitions and how to implement the standard. And that may well include a translation table. The idea that you have a definition and then it is actually can be addressed in different ways. This is for the technical audience, this is for the strategic audience, this is for a business audience, this is for an analytics audience. And then creation of an implementation group where there were some experts that you know, it could be a group that changes from time to time, but where people who are new to becoming counter compliant, new to that area of publishing, would be able to ask advice and get additional help. And in terms of international reach, there's quite a lot of talk about, you know, who else to ask. An editor has been particularly successful in that environment. In terms of inclusiveness, we did focus quite a lot on shared use because it's a new area and was seen an area where counter needs to be proactive. And so we need to get a better mechanism for garnering response from counter members. But there are a number of different things that are already happening in this space. There's an STM committee, Crossref is already looking at DOI tracking and event logging. And we decided as a group, one of the conclusions that was made was that it's probably best to first focus on the version of record and look at the accepted manuscripts later, because of the problem with tracking them if they don't have DOIs. But that would involve consulting institutional repository managers and repository managers in general. In terms of the stakeholders, we're talking about consulting on requirements from the different groups, and we really came to the point that there could be two levels of counter-compliance. Where there are monetary transactions for subscriptions and purchase, or because APCs are involved, that data needs to be audited externally, which has a cost to it, and that would be counter-compliance, pretty much what counter-compliance is now, although the reports might be different. But there could be an additional suite of reports that really are more concerned with usage impact, which wouldn't necessarily need to be audited, and that would reduce the cost as a barrier to entry. And we could talk about that as being reports that conform with counter. And finally, we looked at trust, and we felt that through some of these exercises and further consultation, much could be handled by better compliance, better education, including different methods of use in the reports. But the robots remain a problem which will be an ongoing issue. And the real conclusion is that the devil is going to be in the detail, and Counter will continue to consult and find best fit of requirements and ability to implement. But the real aim has got to be to simplify the reports, but offer a suite of reports to offer all or most of the use cases. And that was it.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, sorry, paranoid. Okay, so we have Rob Johnson now on research management. So this is looking at how institutions support and manage research activity, which is a broad and a bit of an unwieldy topic. I saw the flip charts.
Oh yes, we had a lot of flip charts, which I'm afraid I have lost nearly all of what we discussed, probably in distilling things down, so apologies to those who were in the workshop, but I'll try and give a flavour of what we covered. So we started working in 3 groups just to try and identify what the problem was that we wanted to discuss, and came up with 3 different perspectives on the challenges around research management. So the first was that really current organisational cultures within institutions are not conducive to effective research management. So because they're very devolved institutions, there's not necessarily commonality of purpose and agreement on what research management is. That's the first challenge. The second group discussed the fact there's a lack of authoritative information. So there's not a lot of commonality around standards and terminology, and that actually creates great difficulties in managing research. And lastly, for those actually seeking to advise researchers on what to do, it can be really difficult to give consistent and accurate advice. So researchers can hear very different messages, perhaps from different stakeholders at different times. So that again makes it much more difficult to manage research effectively. So we then dug into each of these a little bit further. So the challenge around culture and the culture not being conducive to research management, at the crux of that there is this tension between what's called managerialism and academic freedom, and the way that plays out within institutions is really interesting. Another thing is that we have these very fixed reward structures and career paths within academia that increasingly are not aligned with policies. So I think people were particularly thinking about open access policies and the incentives or lack of incentives to make things open access. So there is a mismatch between reward structures, career paths, and some of the policy expectations placed on institutions and researchers. And the challenge that messages and policies are not coordinated. So again, there's this problem of mixed messages, inconsistent messages for researchers. I think in relation to information, there was a recognition that we all need to understand the process better. So whether it's the publishing process or anything else, that actually the flows of information and data are not that well understood. And part of that is because there isn't as much best practice, there aren't as many common standards as there ought to be, and there isn't as much communication and training as there could be. So that undermines this need for authoritative information. And lastly, when we were talking about advice, the challenges we grappled with there is, well, actually, what is the advice to give? Who determines the right advice to give to researchers? Because different stakeholders may have a different perspective on whether we give researchers autonomy to make their own decisions or whether they have to be constrained because of funder policies or institutional policies. And even if we agree what advice needs to be given, who actually gives that to the researchers? So who is the best person to communicate it to them, and how do you deliver it? So we were talking about, do you just try and nudge researchers to do the things we want them to do? Is it a heavy-handed mandate? So we worked through some of those questions. And in terms of solutions, I haven't covered all of the solutions that were discussed, but I just tried to pick out some of the common themes. And I think a big one was around coordination of messages and policies. And that was at multiple levels. So actually, internationally, there was a need for funders and institutions and policymakers and publishers to communicate and to coordinate, and where possible, to try to agree on some commonality of approach. And then even within institutions, there would be a need for librarians to talk to their research office, to talk to the academic leadership, and to coordinate the approaches that they're taking. And secondly, there's this pressing need to have more common language and more common standards. So actually, when we are coordinating the messages, we can express those in a consistent form, and people know what everyone else is talking about. And then having got the common language and standards, perhaps common identifiers, actually use them to say, well, how can we do things better? So let's understand what's happening. Where is information being passed between different stakeholders in the process, and how could we improve that and build on it? And finally, the aim was really to try and make things easy for the researchers. So I think a lot of the groups said, actually, whether it's giving them advice, whether it's trying to change the culture, we have to have better systems behind the scenes that can make things easy and address some of these issues with as little involvement and pressure on the researcher as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. And finally, we have Martha Sedgwick from SAGE on workshop E, which was Innovation within Publishing. Are publishers becoming software companies?
Yeah. So, we gave ourselves the sort of modest challenge to address the question, given the impact of digital technologies on scholarly communications, how should publishers be innovating? And I have control. And so we started off the workshop by trying to sort of explode out what the big questions were around the room in relation to that topic. And these are the sort of big four that we came up with. So should we be leading or following transformation in academia more widely? Should publishers focus on content, services, or software, or all of the above? What's our role? How can you make innovation happen within your organization, and how do we protect our current business while pursuing our traditional businesses whilst pursuing innovation? And we had a number of really excellent case studies that were written for the workshop, which I will remember to post on the LinkedIn blog, and I encourage you to read. So there's one for digital science that Phil here wrote, and one for eLife, which Peter here wrote. I did the one for Sage, and we also had one on Nature and Zapnito, really looking at how each of our organisations has approached innovation, how we've structured ourselves, and what, how we've shaped our strategies. And I think it's fascinating seeing some of the different approaches. So I recommend you to look at those after I post them. But we then sort of, we tried to bring that evidence in to tackle some of these questions, and decided sort of after that and leading into today to really hone down our focus to try and specifically create a set of ingredients that we thought would be useful across publishing organisations for publishers wanting to innovate, to say, well, these are the 9 ingredients that you can turn into a recipe of your own, that will have your own flavour, but make sure you sort of work through some of these are sort of critical to think about. So really became quite practical approach that I hope will be useful for everyone. And my workshop, well, there's lots of you in the room, jump in if I have missed anything, because we got quite heated in our debate towards the end, and I've taken the liberty of trying to summarise here. So I'll just work through some of these. So the number one being, innovating as a publisher, one of the key things is around communicating out to the full organisation and really galvanising the organisation around what you're doing, for them to understand the rationale, the balance of the focus on the traditional with the focus on the new. Second area was really thinking carefully about and framing your innovation strategy. We talked about red ocean, blue ocean, iterative innovation versus taking a more radical approach to look at new markets. And so it's important to sort of work that through, think that through, and frame that as part of your innovation strategy. As we're thinking then next sort of coming to products themselves, making sure that we are tackling a problem, really understanding our user base and that problem as we work through what the solution is, what the product is, what the innovation is that you're looking to pursue. And we had arguments about how quickly number 4 goes hot on the heels of number 3, and I think leave with differing opinions, but then really thinking about how you then commercialize that solution, that innovation, and defining a sort of go-to-market methodology and business model. Number 5 was about being serious about the investment. We talked about some of the challenges for people in the room around trying to sort of layer innovation and new product development on top of existing day jobs. And I think, so sort of took away this call to be really serious about the investment if you want to see sort of a significant change and significant innovation coming out of your organization. We talked about establishing an ideation process, so a process by which you can pull in ideas from people across the business to not just your innovation team or your new product team, to really support, to get the best, to get the sort of brains of everyone engaging with your markets and get the best ideas on the table. We talked about different approaches to building in-house versus buying companies or investing in companies, and where you might take one approach over another depending on your strategy, but keeping open and flexible to all opportunities. We talked about decision-making process, and actually so one of the challenges can be internally within organisations getting approvals and moving products through a development process and workflow, and having something very clearly mapped out with the right stakeholders making decisions at the right moments can really aid the process of developments through to the point of launch. And finally, and Phil was just reminding me this should be at the top, but this is not an order of priority. So last but not least, I shall say, failing fast and remembering to sort of embrace failure, try and do it before you spent too much money, got too far out into the market, but really recognizing where things haven't worked, learning from them, and recognizing that as a group and moving on to do something better next time. So those are our ingredients to Innovate. I hope that is food for thought for everyone.
That's great, thank you. So we do have time for some questions, if we have any, from the floor. If you put your hand up, there's microphones coming down towards you. There's one here at the front.
Hi, it's not a question so much as a comment. So it was interesting that 2, if not 3 of the workshops recommended DOIs on acceptance for various reasons. I just wanted to pull that out for everybody.
Thank you. Any more questions for any of our speakers or any more comments, observations? There's one at the back. Mark at the back.
Mark Harden. Kind of a meta question I'd like to ask, really, which is, I wonder whether the workshop presenters would like to say something about how the workshops themselves went in terms of process and participation and fun and all those kind of things. One of the things I've predicted with them at workshops is that they tend to fill up with a mixture of experts who love the topic and really want to get into it, and the, I'm going to say, naive or ill-informed people who want to know a lot more and have gone to the workshop to hear from the experts. So, I mean, can you comment on the sort of the process and the dynamic and how that all worked?
I'll go first. So I think in our workshop there was a really good mix of people coming from different backgrounds, people coming from the question from different areas, so institutions, librarians, and publishers as well. So for us, definitely, it was a really good place for us to explore some of these ideas and get to grips with what problems our colleagues are having, even though we may not necessarily be able to talk to them about it all the time. So for me, as someone coming from publishing, specifically working in the marketing department, it was interesting to hear from librarians about how they think things should be done, and you know, that they also see that there's a need for change. So I think that was a good way of doing it.
Shall I go next? I really enjoyed the workshop format and the opportunity to spend quite a lot of time with a group of people over a series of days and sort of get to know each other, sort of, and tackle problems, challenges. I think I would do it completely differently if I was doing it again. I've sort of learned about getting to the end of this one, so hopefully it's useful to get lessons learned. But I think we should have, in our one, we should have spent longer at the beginning, sort of actually narrowing down the topic and presenting to provide, because I think, just as you said, Mark, there's a real range of levels and of knowledge and you know, different types of organisations, people in the room, and I think we could have spent longer presenting at the beginning, actually, to create a framework from which to leap off into the discussion, rather than trying to just dive into discussion with everyone sort of all over the place. So that would be one of my things that I'd take away, and give people more time to read the case studies.
From my perspective, I think because we had a quite a focused subject, which there was already an aim, it meant that there were quite a few people who were pretty expert in the room, and we could delve into quite a lot of detail that, with a very, very broad subject, is quite difficult. So we had a relatively small group as well, so it was actually quite conducive to looking at quite specific issues. And I think we did follow a path where we worked through and discussed things and did come up with some suggestions, if not answers, about where to go forward. But it does depend on the topic as to how easy that is to do. But I thought it was very successful and you know, really enjoyable.
Nothing to add from me.
It's difficult to know in advance whether you've got the right mix of people, obviously. And the subscription agency workshop, I mean, we had a room full of publishers, all anxious to grill subscription agents, and we had a room full, the other half of the room was full of subscription agents, all anxious to justify themselves. And we had to go out and raid a local library to find somebody who actually knew what she was talking about in this respect. Sven, who organised it did a superb job, I have to say. He's had to fly back to Frankfurt this afternoon, so he's not here anymore. I might have argued with him about the way he ran it, but I think in the end, you know, if you volunteer to run a workshop, you should be allowed to do it.
Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions, we'll move on to the summary of the conference. And I'd like to finish by thanking all of our chairs, scribes, presenters, experts who helped the chairs, and obviously participants for making the workshops happen and as successful as they've been. I've only heard good things in coffee breaks and even in the toilets, overhearing behind closed doors good things about the workshops. So I think on the whole, success. Thank you very much, everybody.